Welcome to Two Doctors Homestead. My name is Janet, and this is Prepper Pantry Tip of the Week. And this week, we're going to talk about yeast. Now, yeast is one thing that you want to make sure that you prep for your pantry. It has a relatively good shelf life at 2 years. You can get big blocks of yeast like this. I prefer to get this off of Amazon because for me it's the cheapest to get it there. But you can get big blocks like this. You could get bottles, small bottles of yeast at the grocery store. You could get these little individual packets, which has, I believe, 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast in each packet. There's a bunch of different ways to get yeast, but the most important thing to know is that yeast lasts for 2 years, but it's recommended by the manufacturer in a cool place. So they recommend that you store it in the fridge or the freezer if you want a 2-year shelf life. Now, when this yeast is opened, the yeast is going to last 4 months in the fridge and 6 months in the freezer. So when you think of something like that, and for the long-term prepper pantry, it may not be feasible that you might, if something happens, you might not have electricity, you might not be able to store your yeast in a cool place. And then you have all of this flour and sugar, and you're thinking, how am I going to make bread? I guess I'm just making flat bread. Well, today I'm going to show you how to capture wild yeast so you will never have to be without your bread again in the apocalypse. So, yeast pretty much grows on everything. You have yeast on you, there's yeast on the counter, there's yeast on plants, there's yeast on vegetables, there's yeast everywhere in the environment. It's natural yeast. So for our purposes today, we're going to use dried yeast. So we're going to take some dried cherries, and all you have to do is take, some dried fruit, fresh fruit as well, and we're just going to pour it. We're going to pour it here into our bottle, our mason jar. And once you get it in your mason jar, you're going to want to fill that mason jar with water. Put a piece of towel or pretty much anything. You could have a Vin towel, you could use a coffee filter, anything. And you're going to fill this with water, top it up. You're going to want to have some type of towel or something so you can have the air get in it. And the reason for that is when this starts to ferment and the yeast starts to grow, it's going to put out gases, and you want those gases to be able to escape without blowing the top of the bottle off or having oozing coming out. So what you'll see in about 5 to 10 days is you will see that the water will start to get cloudy. You'll start to get bubbles on top of the water, and you'll also start to get like a white film on top of the water. Once the water starts having little bubbles, like active bubbles in it that you could see when you look, and it has foam on the top, it's ready to use. You have captured your wild yeast at this point. To use it, all you're going to do is just strain this. So you're going to take out these berries. Don't throw the berries out because the berries at this point are fermented, and you could use them and throw them in your bread or put them in any of your other food. And you'll be left with an entire bottle then of yeast water. And when you use your yeast water, you use your yeast water just like you're going to put your water in your recipe. You're going to pour it in, and you're going to mix it up, and then you're going to you're going to proof your bread in a warm place. Now, it may take a little longer for you to get the rise that you're looking for because we are so used to this. We're used to this yeast that rises fast, and this has been domesticated and, cultured yeast, and the standard of this is pretty much the same. You're going to get the same results with this consistently most of the time. Now, a wild yeast you're not going to get consistent results with, but the nice thing is you don't have to prep really for any of it. Should an emergency happen, you could go outside and you can, grab some rose petals, and you could put the rose petals in here, and you can ferment, and you can, it is a fermentation process. You can ferment that, and you can get your yeast off of that. So you really don't need to store anything. You don't need to stock anything for wild yeast, because yeast is here and it's all around us. So should something really happen and we need to go back to the old ways of making bread, this is the old ways of making bread. You're going to capture the yeast off of the environment, and then you're going to use it, to make your bread. Again, it may take 10 hours to proof it, where some of this stuff that we're used to off the shelves now would only take 1 or 2 to proof it to get the rise, but you will get the rise eventually of what you're looking for. Now, if you do look at fruits such as grapes and blueberries, that white little powdery residue of a bloom that's on them, that is actually wild yeast. So, should you come across some wild blueberries, those would be great to be able to make your yeast with. So once you have yeast water, if you save a little bit of that yeast water at the bottom, you can top it up with water, sprinkle a little pinch of sugar in it to give the yeast a carbohydrate to feed off of, and it will continue to replicate. So when you make your first batch with whatever your fruit is, you can then continue to have a batch going, much like a sourdough starter, but this you would keep on the counter at room temperature. Now, if you want to make a sourdough starter, all you have to do is take your wild yeast, add some flour to it, and that's it. That becomes a sourdough starter. And you would let that sourdough starter, then you would let the yeast water eat the carbohydrate and the flour, and that would start to bubble, and then that's how you have a sourdough starter. So sometimes you actually don't need to stock your shelf to be able to, bake or use other items in your pantry in an emergency. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you for watching.